Hello again, and welcome to chessopenings.com. Today is all about the aggressive Sicilian defense, which begins with the moves pawn to e4 and the counter-aggressive response pawn to c5. Let's take a look. Now, with the Sicilian defense, Black sets up an effective counter strategy against White's plan to expand his position with the move d2 to d4. Now, Black is aiming to capture on d4 with a flank pawn. So for example, if here this took place, by capturing at the flank pawn, Black gives himself a central majority. He has two pawns in the center versus White's one. And he also has an open c-file in this position. Both of these factors are useful for aggressive operations, and they're useful for restraining White's attacking ideas. Normally, however, White just goes ahead and he prepares to play d4 first with this move knight f3, and then he goes ahead and he prepares to play d4 anyway. And he's just going to accept that Black is going to get this central majority, but White knows that he will get extra space, and he'll have grounds for attacking. He'll get a very centralized knight and a great attacking position. But today, I want to look at another strategy which White can use to try to put pressure on the Sicilian defense, and also to try to steer the game away from more theoretical positions. This strategy begins with the move knight to c3. Now, this is the beginning of an attacking setup in which White largely abandons his aim of achieving d2 to d4 in hopes of a more aggressive kingside strategy. Now, how does this work? First, this simple developing move cements White's control of the d5 square. He has two pieces now defending the d5 square. And for this reason, he's prevented Black from playing d5 himself. Black cannot play d5 in the current position. So, after the almost universal reply, knight to c6, Black has made another natural developing move, but White is now ready to declare what is his strategy which he has in mind. And in these positions, White's not going to expand with d2 to d4, he's going to expand with f2 to f4. And when this is played straight away, this is what the books call the Grand Prix attack. White wastes no time gaining space on the king side. He brings out this f-pawn before developing his knight so that the pawn can get out of there, and he gets a lot of space on the king side. And right away, White has a goal to start playing for checkmate right from the first moves. He wants to use this extra space and use rapid development to get at Black's king as quickly as possible. So Black normally continues his development with this move pawn to g6, which is the most natural way of developing the dark squared bishop in this position. And now, after the moves knight f3 and bishop g7, we get a clearer picture of what's going on here, and you can almost call this position the starting point of the Grand Prix attack. Since White hasn't begun any active operations in the center, Black has had time to solidify his control over the d4 square. In fact, each of his first four moves has in a way contributed to the defense of d4. You see that his pawn, his knight, and his bishop are all contributing to the defense of the d4 square. This inhibits White from playing d2 to d4 himself, which is clearly not a possibility here. And it also means that later in the middle game, it's going to be very easy for Black to sink a knight in this square and really get some gusto in the position. He often combines getting his knight on d4 with breaking b5 and then b4. And together, this makes the position highly dynamic for Black and gives him lots of options. On the other hand, White only needs to do three things to complete his development in this position. The first thing he needs to do is he needs to find a square for the light squared bishop. Secondly, he's going to want to castle kingside, and he's also going to want to push the d-pawn one square forward. In this case, he can't push it all the way to d4. So he pushes the pawn one square, and this gives the dark squared bishop some scope. Now, how does White finally take down the king? The idea here is that he's going to use a queen transfer, queen to e1, to g3 or h4, and then he's going to use central thrust such as f5 or e5, and he's going to try to take down the king side in short order. These themes are going to be a huge part of everything we look at today, so you may want to review them at the end, maybe once or twice after the video is over, so that you can help these ideas really sink in. So, the stage is set. The first order of business is finding a square for White's light squared bishop. The most thematic move is bishop to c4. Now, here, the bishop is vulnerable to stabs by an eventual pawn to b5 move, like we said black is going to play, or an eventual pawn to d5 move. It does have the benefit, however, of putting immediate pressure on black's position. So, for example, we see that this bishop is already putting some pressure on f7. In fact, after the normal move, pawn to e6, white has an option to crack at black's position immediately with pawn to f5, which is very interesting. It's a positional pawn sacrifice, which sets a couple of deep traps. Now, if black takes the pawn with g takes f5, white calmly continues pawn to d3, knight g to e7. So this is a long-term sacrifice on white's part. He simply castles with the idea now of bringing the queen to g3, exactly the sort of things which you described. He's moved his bishop out, he's moved the pawn one square, he's castled, he's now ready to bring the queen to an aggressive square. If you're white, you've got to be smelling blood already here, since black's kingside position is going to be very difficult to defend, and there's a big chance of sacrificial attacks. A similar, more interesting trap comes from the line if he uses the e-pawn to capture. So pawn takes pawn, and now pawn to d3, knight g to e7 once again, castles again, castles again, and now queen e1. This time the queen's headed to h4. And after d6, we would play queen to h4, and this is another way that the pawn sacrifice can go. At first glance, you may not see why this position is just so strong for white. However, white does have a lot going for him here. In the first instance, this bishop is very easy to include in the attack, either on g5 or on h6. Additionally, we might use the move knight to d5 to put pressure on black's position. Now, how did sacrificing the pawn help white to achieve this situation? There's two reasons. The first reason is that without the pawn on f4, we clearly can get this bishop in much faster. That's one function of removing the f-pawn. Another key factor here is that by enticing the e-pawn to move to f5, the bishop on c4 has become quite a monster here. It's not blunted by the pawn on e6, and it's much more difficult for black to stab it with d5 and shut this bishop down. So this ends up being a very, very tricky position for black, and it's very promising for white. Both of his bishops have a lot of active play here, and this is a very easy trap for black to fall into, and one of the things that makes the Grand Prix attack just so attractive for white. However, if black is very well prepared, he'll know not to take the gambit, and will instead continue his development calmly with the move knight g to e7, an outstanding move. Now, black's trying to get in this strong move, pawn to d5. This is a great way for black to take advantage of the placement of white's bishop on c4. Now, pretty common, white tends to play pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now d3, and black's ready to start sticking it to this bishop with d5, bishop b3, and pawn to b5. Now this move takes advantage of a couple tactical points. White cannot capture the pawn on b5 because of this check on a5, which is at first a fork. First we're attacking this knight and the king. Now if you're paying really close attention here, you might see that, well, white can simply retreat the knight here. However, he's now in a pin, and black wins material with the move pawn to d4. So, as it turns out, white cannot capture this pawn on b5, and this makes pawn to b5 an outstanding move, creating some threats. The position here is unclear. On the one hand, black seems to have a queenside initiative here, but at the same time, his position seems a little loose, and his kingside is underdeveloped. On the other hand, he's already gotten quite a powerful initiative on the queen side. So recent results seem to suggest that black may even have a slight edge here, but the position is mostly unclear, and it's certainly playable and interesting from both points of view. So let's back up to before this aggressive pawn sacrifice, pawn to f5. If white thinks that black might know how to respond to this pawn sacrifice properly, he can sometimes proceed more calmly by simply castling kingside. Now, again, black had better be quite careful. If he doesn't know his stuff and just plays calmly, let's say pawn to d6, d3, knight to e7, queen to e1, white is already in a pretty nice position here. If he can simply play queen h4 and f5, he can easily get a great version of the pawn sacrifice lines merely by delaying it. So this simple method of play almost seems to solve all of white's problems, but I'm afraid it just doesn't work out quite like that. Just as we saw before, if black is keen on taking advantage of the position of this bishop, he can get some better play for himself. So instead of this lackadaisical move, pawn to d6 like we played before, black should instead play knight to e7, and now after d3, castles, and queen e1, since he hasn't wasted a tempo on the d-pawn, he can go ahead and play immediately pawn to d5, and after bishop b3, there follows knight to d4. And again, this is an unclear position where black has compensation for white's space on the king side. He has a well-centralized knight, his pieces are getting out comfortably, and the position turns out to be okay for both sides. So it turns out that white has some very dangerous attacking ideas after this move bishop to c4. However, if white is super careful about blunting this bishop and attacking this bishop, black seems to get a decent and maybe even an attractive game. So because of this, white has also developed another system here, which is instead of bringing the bishop to c4, he brings it all the way out to b5, and this is also certainly possible. Here, white just plans to exchange the bishop off immediately and damage black's pawn structure in the meantime. In fact, again, if black is not vigilant and merely goes along with this, he gets himself into big trouble immediately. Let's say pawn to e6, and now white just rips this knight off the board. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now this great move e5. Look at that, taking advantage of these weak and dark squares. Now typically, black actually plays pawn to d5 here, and play continues pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, d3, opening up this bishop and defending that pawn, knight to f6, castles, and castles. Now, yes, white lacks his typical attacking chances on the king side, but black's doubled, isolated c-pawns, they make a very bad impression here, and they can easily turn out to be very weak in the endgame. In practical terms, black has bad results in this position. So, it turns out that once again, if black doesn't know his stuff, you can easily catch him in these kinds of positions. However, black can be more proactive in this position, and he can instead play the great move knight to d4 here. And now, white has tended to work out that the best move here is simply to castle. And now, knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, and now once again we see this move pawn to d5, which is a great move for black here. Now, white still has a development advantage here. He has two pieces out, and he's castled compared to black only having one piece out. But he's lost the bishop pair, and his position is a little bit unstable. So clearly white can't count on his traditional kingside attack in these positions either. But there are still some interesting points here. White has a choice. If he plays the natural move, pawn takes pawn, black can get easy equality if he knows what he's doing with the move a6. Great move. Now knight c3, knight f6, and now white needs to act quickly. If black simply recaptures the pawn on d5 and completes his development, he'll have the bishop pair, he'll have better minor pieces, and he'll have a harmonious position. So white opens things up quickly with the move pawn to d4, his only real chance in this position. And now play sometimes goes knight takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight takes knight, queen takes queen, check, king takes, pawn takes knight, and bishop takes pawn. And this is an unclear, but probably pretty equal endgame here. Black has some problems completing his development in this position, but he's managed to hold on to the bishop pair and he has a superior pawn structure. This is probably not what white wants out of the opening, so if he thinks that, black is going to go ahead and play for something like this, he has some options. And the best place to make a deviation here is rather than taking this pawn on d5, white often plays pawn to e5, and I think this is probably just a stronger option here. And now, after pawn to a6 and knight to c3, play can go any number of ways, but white's ready to play this move d4 and get a slight space advantage, and he might be able to play for a gradual building up sort of game. So an example of how play has gone in the past is bishop to g4, pawn to d4, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, and now let's say pawn to e6. And there's an interesting move here, queen to b4, which sets some interesting problems. We're attacking this pawn on b7, and we're making it a little bit tricky for black to get his king out of the center. And this is an interesting little position. Maybe white has a slight advantage here. And you'd think that queen e7 would be a strong move here, but this is actually a trap. Now white would play queen to a4 check. And you can't block this check with pawn to b5 because white would simply capture, right? He would make use of this pin, and now you're in big trouble. And you don't really want to move the king here, so what do you have left to do? Well, you have to trade queens. But now after queen takes queen and king takes queen, this move knight to a4 is very strong for white, and white definitely has an advantage in this position. So, in this position after queen b4, it looks like white might have a tiny advantage. The Grand Prix attack is an attempt by white to blow black to pieces right from the word go. We've seen that there's plenty of traps for black to fall into. However, if he's very well prepared, we'll tend to get a very unclear game, which is also very suited for good play for white, but also for black. If you like some of the plans which you saw here, you'll notice that one of the problems white kept running into is where to place his light squared bishop. If you're very attracted to these ideas for white, you may want to take a look at the video on the closed Sicilian, in which we'll look at another way white might be able to solve this problem of the light squared bishop. But for now, we've seen plenty of ways to try to get black right from the start, and I think you might want to experiment with these positions and see if you can get a couple of quick checkmates in. That's it for now, and I look forward to seeing you again.